For decades, millions of Star Trek fans were unaware of a particular episode of the show. Its message was encased in a metaphor so potent and contentious that it evoked the deepest wounds in a country, not because it was badly written or unentertaining. This episode went too far in a franchise that is renowned for daringly venturing where no one has gone before. It was viewed as a stain on the show's reputation and was openly banned in Germany while being subtly avoided elsewhere. But what really was so risky about it? And why did its reappearance take so long? Come along as we reveal the sinister backstory of the Star Trek episode that they wanted you to miss. And why its message is more important than ever today. Pattern of Force is the episode in question. Fans usually bring up iconic sequences like Spock's philosophical arguments with Bones or Captain Kirk's kiss with Lieutenant Uhura when talking about the most audacious moments in Star Trek history. Patterns of Force, one of the franchise's most visually stunning and striking episodes, is hardly ever spoken up, though. Patterns of Force was a unique television show when it debuted in 1968 as the 21st episode of Star Trek, the second season of the original series. The plot looked at first like any other Trek adventure. When the Enterprise crew finds a planet that has deviated from the Federation's ideals, Kirk and Spock decide to look into it, step in, and bring morality back. However, this episode was distinctive not just because of how it was portrayed but also because of its images. The stunning image that greeted viewers was a perfect replica of Nazi Germany. The rhetoric, the flags, the salutes, the propaganda, the uniforms. It wasn't just symbolic. It was quite literal. National Socialism in its purest form has been adopted by a planetary government on Echoes under the leadership of a renegade Earth historian named John Gill. Swastikas were worn by their soldiers. Their TV shows repeated speeches from the Hitler era. Their brutal methods were a reflection of fascism in the real world. The reasoning was disturbing in the fictitious world. Formerly a respected cultural observer for the Federation, Gill came to the conclusion that Nazi Germany's social framework, aside from the genocide, was effective and could provide stability to a divided world. In order to maintain peace, he put this system into place on Echoes. But the result was catastrophic. The corruption spread to immense. It was dominated by the ideological apparatus. And once more, even in a fictional extraterrestrial environment, the horrors of Nazism surfaced. Viewers are shown a startling scene as Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock sneak into the regime while posing as troops. Two of science fiction's most beloved characters, dressed totally in SS uniforms, navigating a totalitarian environment. Even in America, where the show first aired uncensored, the sight alone was enough to frighten viewers. However, the reaction reached a far more serious level in Europe, particularly in Germany. The public display of Nazi insignia was and is still subject to strict regulations in post-war Germany. The country took a conscious, legal action to prevent its most heinous period from being glorified or trivialized. They were more than just offensive. They were forbidden in all public broadcasts, regardless of the situation. As a result, Patterns of Force was completely rejected when it was suggested for broadcast. For decades, German networks prohibited it from airing. In addition to being silently forbidden, the program was not broadcast on German television from 1968 until the middle of the 1990s. Even Star Trek box sets and publication bundles in Germany largely ignored it for a long time. It was the missing component of the show, disregarded, forgotten, and purposefully removed from German viewers' experiences. Without any explanation of what happened in between episodes 20 and 22, viewers would jump from one to the next. Even more astounding is the fact that Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry did not intend to shock for the purpose of shocking. In actuality, Patterns of Force was intended to serve as a warning story and a purposefully disturbing indictment of the ways in which fascism might pass for progress and order. No promotion was given. A denunciation was made. However, some viewers found the execution to be too offensive to tolerate, even with its admirable objectives. This resulted in a challenge that would reverberate for years throughout Star Trek's history. What happens when the hard facts of actual trauma clash with a series based on the ideas of free thought, moral complexity, and political metaphors. Is it possible for fiction to go too far? And should filmmakers be held accountable for the emotional toll their films take, especially in countries where they deal with recent trauma? The first reaction in the Patterns of Force case was a loud nay. Better not to display it at all, it seemed. The episode had an almost legendary aura because of its absence. Rumors about the Nazi incident circulated among enthusiasts. While some thought the Federation had authorized it, increasing its appeal, others conjectured that it was forbidden for being too honest. The fact that it was absent was simple and profoundly important. The images in this episode brought Babbitt's anguish uncomfortably near to the traumatic past. The episode was true, though. For those who were lucky enough to see it, whether via bootlegs, imported VHS tapes, or later digital releases, it was a powerful reminder of Star Trek's courage to take up difficult subjects, even at the risk of censorship. You have to look beyond Star Trek and consider the history of a whole country attempting to recover from unimaginable traumas in order to comprehend why Patterns of Force was prohibited. For what reason was it prohibited? Germany was still dealing with the severe effects of World War II in the late 1960s. The country was faced with the unpleasant challenge of recreating itself just 20 years after the fall of the Third Reich. Not just on an infrastructure level, but also on a moral and emotional one. The Holocaust was more than just a historical event. It was a strong, upsetting memory that affected families, communities, and institutions profoundly. Any attempt to portray Nazi philosophy, even in fictitious novels, was closely scrutinized in this delicate environment. A consensus had been established in Germany. Nazi emblems were dangerous in addition to being unpleasant. The German government enacted strict criminal laws after the war in an effort to stop the spread of far-right extremism. The German Criminal Code Section 86AA made it unlawful to show Nazi symbols like the Hitler salute, the SS badge, or the swastika, irrespective of whether they were employed in fictional or artistic contexts. Even when used in satire or critical commentary, these symbols were not allowed to be aired in public unless they were used in a highly controlled historical or educational context. As a result, when German censors examined the Star Trek episode Patterns of Force, their decision was prompt and final. The story's underlying message and its desire to condemn fascism were not the matter at hand. Instead, it was the visual depiction of officers dressed in SS uniforms, swastika-adorned buildings, and rallies that eerily echoed Hitler's speeches that transcended a major legal and cultural barrier. Interpretation was out of the question. The visuals alone were enough to justify a complete ban. But Germany wasn't the only place where networks felt uneasy due to force patterns. Although it wasn't outright banned elsewhere, many nations either delayed its broadcast or changed key scenes. Fearing possible public backlash, broadcasters in the UK and certain Scandinavian regions showed hesitancy. The episode was often completely left out of publication deals sent to television networks around the world, not because it had been forgotten or lost, but rather because the distributors were afraid of causing controversy. This raises a difficult question. Did the episode's prohibition serve as a form of cultural censorship, or was it a show of responsible sensitivity? The argument put up by those opposed to the ban was that Patterns of Force was the exact narrative that needed to be told. After all, the entire episode served as a fictional cautionary tale about the allure of dictatorship and a moral lesson. The ill-fated attempt by John Gill to imitate Nazi Germany was not shown as admirable. Rather, it was presented as a tragic tale motivated by moral blindness and intellectual arrogance, a cautionary tale. In actuality, the program was a critique of all that Nazi ideology stood for. However, if the message was upsetting, German officials didn't care about the impact of the medium. They were not concerned that Star Trek would lead viewers to embrace fascism. Instead, it was the possibility that its imagery may be upsetting, distressing, or even re-traumatizing, even in a fictional setting. They needed to take historical context into account. Far-right organizations had used the media to quietly reintroduce fascist ideas in the years after the war. The swastika was more than just a historical symbol. It was still a powerful political instrument. Therefore, it was considered too risky to allow it to re-emerge on German television screens, even in a science fiction story. There was also the matter of tone. Patterns of Force was still a primetime entertainment program, as opposed to historical dramas or documentaries that depicted the Nazi government with accuracy and gravity. Its characters were realistic, even humorous, and its sets were theatrical. Some detractors contended that using Nazi symbols in this way ran the risk of, even unwittingly, lessening their importance. Although it was contradictory to see Spock and Kirk dressed in SS uniforms, was there a fun undertone as well? Many found it disconcerting that real-world horrors were combined with sci-fi fantasies. These concerns may have seemed distant to spectators in the United States. In the US, Star Trek was widely praised for tackling difficult moral issues. The show received praise for examining topics including racism, war, civil rights, and political corruption through the use of extraterrestrial worlds. For American authors, Patterns of Force was just another bold installment in a series that challenged viewers to confront the most sinister facets of history. However, not everyone agreed with this point of view. What was considered brave in one country can be seen as heartless in another. It's also critical to emphasize that there was little public outcry when the episode Patterns of Force was banned. This episode slipped into obscurity, unlike today's conflicts where censorship sparks instant online discussions. During the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s, German viewers of Star Trek were not aware of any content that was missing. There was no explanation for the series' abrupt change from episode 20 to episode 22. This silence prevented viewers from considering one of the franchise's most obvious political themes for a long time. Ironically, the episode's importance might have been increased by its unavailability. Fans thought they had found a hidden gem when they eventually came across the restricted episode. One that asked more difficult questions than most TV shows. Why did a Federation historian think Nazism may be effective? If peace is based on tyranny, how questionable is it? And how quickly may good intentions turn into evil deeds? In the end, Star Trek was not intended to be silenced by the ban on Patterns of Force. Instead, it aimed to demonstrate that Patterns of Force wasn't an isolated incident and to protect a country's efforts to regain its moral compass. Star Trek has a lengthy history of defying expectations, which has caused criticism in several nations. Episode 1 of Star Trek Beyond features censorship. Perhaps the most well-known banned episode in Star Trek history is Patterns of Force. However, it's not the only time the franchise has run afoul of governments, broadcasters, or cultural agencies. Star Trek has continuously questioned conventions throughout its long and illustrious history, forcing networks and society to confront problems they would rather avoid. These conflicts frequently resulted in redaction, suppression, or silence. Think about the episode of Next Generation. The Superior Position. This Season 3 episode, which debuted in the United States in 1990, at first seemed to be just another moral quandary set on a distant world. The plot centered on a conflict between a militant separatist party seeking independence and an oppressive government. The Enterprise crew must consider the morality of loyalty, terrorism, and negotiation after the rebels kidnap Dr. Beverly Crusher. However, a startling statement, especially for British viewers, was concealed behind a single line of conversation. In a conversation with Captain Picard, statistics regarding the history of terrorism indicate that terrorist tactics were also used to gain Irish unification in 2024. In the UK, the program was delayed because of that one sentence. Remembering the political climate of that time is crucial to understanding the logic behind this. With the Irish Republican Army, IRA, aggressively waging a bloody campaign against British rule, tensions in Northern Ireland remained high in 1990. Threats were imminent and real, including bombings, killings, and run-ins with the law. Not only was it insulting, but it might have been inflammatory for the BBC and other UK broadcasters to air an episode that seemed to support or foretell Irish reunification through terrorist activities. As a result, British television did not air Star Trek: The High Ground, episode 12 until 2007. Even yet, the controversial line was left out of other editions. It was likewise off the air for many years in Ireland. Once more, the delicate subjects of a country's political pain had come into contact with a single instance in Star Trek. But the show's struggles with restriction went beyond issues of politics. Due to its treatment of racism, sexuality, mental health, and even gender norms, Star Trek has also been banned and edited. Plato's Stepchildren, an episode of the original series that aired in 1968, shortly after Patterns of Force, was essentially unremarkable save for one particular moment, the first interracial kiss on American television. Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura are forced to share a kiss in front of a hostile alien audience while under the effects of telekinetic mind control. This occasion is now frequently celebrated as a major turning point. But it was highly contentious at the time. In order to lower the episode's viewership, certain television stations in many southern U.S. states either decided not to air it or moved it to late-night times. Many advertisers backed out of the airing, and NBC received a deluge of protest letters. As a precaution, the studio even produced a different version of the scene in which the kiss was implied but not seen. There is also the Whom Gods Destroy episode from Season 3 of the original series, which is set in a mental hospital run by the Federation. A former Starfleet captain who has gone insane and taken over the asylum is the primary enemy, Garth Vassar. His erratic behavior, violent outbursts, and mockery of mental illness made the incident extremely controversial in a number of countries. The episode's depiction of mental illness as both hazardous and unpredictable led to its removal from the original broadcast lineup in the UK. Because of its allegedly upsetting content, a number of Canadian stations likewise decided not to broadcast it. The program was denounced by mental health advocacy groups for perpetuating negative stereotypes by portraying psychiatric patients as violent and unhelpable. It took a number of years for this program to resurface in several regions, frequently with disclaimers. The prequel Star Trek Enterprise, which aired in the early 2000s, was another source of dispute. More serious themes including torture, biological warfare, and retaliation were added in the third season of the show during the Shindy war plot. A group of religious radicals took over the Enterprise and committed acts of terror under the pretense of faith in a particular episode called Chosen Realm. This episode resonated uncomfortably with real-life circumstances after the events of 9/11. Broadcasters in parts of the Middle East and South Asia either changed or eliminated it entirely from their schedules, despite the fact that it was shown in the United States. Bringing up cultural sensitivity. Some viewers thought it unjustly linked fanaticism and religious dedication. These are only the cases that have been officially documented. Throughout its global impact, Star Trek has frequently undergone editing, muting, or modification in ways that are rarely reported in the media. Scenes showing political commentary, same-sex intimacy, or even particular language have been adapted for local audiences, often without their knowledge. What is considered bold storytelling in one country could be considered subversive or objectionable in another. The fact that Star Trek's censorship was often a reaction rather than a preventative strategy, however, may be the most striking feature of the show's history. The purpose of these occurrences was not to provoke bans. They were intended to elicit contemplation and explore the consequences of a conflict between ideals and reality. Some societies welcomed that conflict, but others weren't ready for it. What is notable is that Star Trek's core message has not changed in spite of all the deletions, restrictions, and changes. That it is worth it to seek the truth, no matter how disturbing it may be. Even if it offends, that discussion is necessary. And even when that reflection is unpleasant, science fiction in particular should never avoid reflecting the real world. For many fans, Star Trek's success can be attributed to its willingness to confront hard realities. It does more than just amusement. It teaches. It provokes. It challenges the audience to examine their own biases, history, and culture. Star Trek has, in fact, been censored. Indeed, it has been forbidden. Nevertheless, the same message is reinforced by every instance. The ideas it contains are powerful. It can occasionally be too overwhelming for everyone to process at once. And that might be the most groundbreaking achievement of the franchise. Star Trek was intended to defy television conventions rather than merely follow them. How Star Trek was intended to defy convention. The series went beyond simple science fiction right from the start. Essentially, it was social fiction. Former police officer turned screenwriter Gene Roddenberry had no desire to write sterile, future fairy tales. Rather, his goal was to use the distant future as a mirror of the chaotic present. Roddenberry bravely envisioned a world free of racism, hunger, and conflict at a time when cozy home sitcoms and inflexible stereotypes dominated American television. More importantly, he saw a time when humanity will find peace by facing its most fundamental defects. This vision, ideal but realistic, became the core of Star Trek's character. In order to appeal to nervous network executives, Roddenberry called the first series a wagon train to the stars when he proposed it to them in the 1960s. Beneath that exterior, though, was a Trojan horse full of political metaphor, social criticism, and complex morals. Roddenberry's business was more than just space travel. It involved negotiating class conflict, gender equality, authoritarianism, racism, metaphors, nuclear danger, and civil upheaval. Even if it meant making viewers uncomfortable, his goal was to get them to think. Roddenberry insisted that the diversity of the planet should be reflected in Star Trek. This required putting a Russian flag, a black female communications officer, and a Japanese-American helmsman on the bridge of a well-known network show in 1966, right in the middle of civil rights movements and Cold War fears. It meant giving them equal standing, communication, and intelligence without treating them like tokens. This was the first time that many viewers, especially those from minority backgrounds, saw themselves represented on television in positions of authority and respect. Lieutenant Uhura's actress, Nichelle Nichols, once considered quitting the show. But a chance encounter with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed her mind. King stated that Star Trek was the only program he allowed his kids to stay up and watch, as Nichols subsequently recalled, stressing that she was playing a role of great cultural significance. Uhura was more than just a fictional character to him and a lot of other people. She stood for an optimistic outlook on the future. Additionally, Roddenberry was a strong supporter of programs that tackled difficult subjects. Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, one of the first, used black and white-faced aliens to make statements about racial divide. A Private Little War, another episode, quietly criticized U.S. involvement in Vietnam. A Taste of Armageddon brought up moral concerns regarding the technological sanitization of warfare. These plots were far from secure. Cleverly camouflaged in exotic clothing and bizarre solar systems, they mimicked headlines from the real world while being essentially human. Behind the scenes, studio pressure to tone things down was often met with resistance from writers and producers. Numerous interviewees described Roddenberry's steadfast defense of contentious screenplays. D.C. Roddenberry was committed to the idea that we were sharing stories that mattered, said Fontana, one of the show's top writers and one of the first prominent women in science fiction television. She recalled that he knew there may be criticism when he walked into network meetings. However, he never felt the need to compromise the show's principles in order to please sponsors. This commitment paid off, perhaps in terms of legacy rather than ratings. Despite only having 3 seasons, the original series became a cultural phenomenon unlike any other. As time went on, critics started to see Star Trek as more than just a genre show, but as perceptive analysis. The progressive nature of the program was later praised in essays published by The Atlantic, Time, and The New York Times. Papers examining its intellectual underpinnings were written by scholars. NASA has admitted that Star Trek increased public interest in space travel and influenced technological developments in the real world. The Next Generation continued this trend of breaking rules when it debuted in 1987. Long before they became popular topics, episodes like Measure of a Man examined personhood and artificial intelligence. The Misfit talked on societal erasing and gender identity. Despite being inconspicuous, Darmok provided a thorough analysis of cultural sensitivity and communication difficulties. Actors and producers of later series often cited Roddenberry's original ideas as a source of inspiration. In interviews, Patrick Stewart, who played Captain Jean-Luc Picard, said that the show's writing dared to ask topics that other television shows wouldn't. Being Janeway on Voyager allowed Kate Mulgrew, the first female captain to command a Star Trek series, to take on a leadership role that had previously been considered unachievable for women on television. Even the most intensive and ethically difficult of the Trek shows, Deep Space Nine, followed Roddenberry's idea of opposing ideologies. It addressed topics that few shows at the time dared to address, such as post-war trauma, terrorism, occupation, and religious extremism. Star Trek used the future to challenge the present rather than just portraying it. The show's boldness, of course, drew criticism. Its idealism, others said, was unrealistic. Others thought its metaphors were too direct. Regardless of whether it was applauded or criticized, one thing was evident. Star Trek promoted critical thinking. It handled cultural concerns without hesitation, even if doing so means alienating certain viewers. That's what Roddenberry's legacy is all about. He wanted a show that was more than just a show. He imagined one that thoughtfully, discreetly, and occasionally explosively sparked thought. He created a franchise that could continue that goal for decades in the face of shifting political landscapes, cultural shifts, and advances in technology. Star Trek is a daring anomaly in the modern media landscape, where a large portion of the content is created to amuse, distract, or follow trends. It began with a notion of active engagement rather than escapism. It's challenging rather than easy. A show that encouraged viewers to see themselves as stewards of history rather than just spectators. This is what makes Star Trek revolutionary. This is why the core of the program stayed constant even when episodes were banned, censored, or misunderstood. Controversy can be strangely reshaped over time. Over time, what was once startling and unnerving might become a subject of curiosity, reconsideration, and even awe. Rediscovery of the force pattern in modern times. With Patterns of Force, this is exactly the situation. The show, which was once considered too inflammatory to air in Germany and covertly removed from a number of foreign markets, has since been resurrected not through censorship, but through careful consideration. Patterns of Force was ultimately broadcast on German television in 1995, over 30 years after it first aired. But it wasn't just added to the schedule of programming. Rather, it was included in a late-night special, which began with background information and then included a conversation. This program was more than just amusement. It turned into a conversation. This was an important change. The episode had changed from being a risky topic to one that should be seen again. Fans and academics alike started to re-evaluate Patterns of Force as one of Star Trek's most intellectually daring episodes by the middle of the 2000s. In addition to discussing its stunning aspects, supporters also examine its moral complexity on sites like Reddit. They discuss John Gill's tragic logic and the morality of maintaining order in the face of chaos. And whether Kirk's resistance to Nazism is more or less significant now than it was in 1968. Additionally, critics have loosened their positions. The program is now widely lauded for its audacious portrayal, despite its earlier condemnation for its overt use of Nazi imagery. It was much ahead of its time to portray a historian who seemed to have compassion bringing back a fascist government. Gill's defense of efficiency over morality strikes a troubling chord at an era when authoritarianism is on the rise everywhere. This tendency has been reflected in academic interest. Research on media ethics, post-war memory, and the impact of science fiction on historical metaphor frequently makes reference to the occurrence. Some scholars argue that by including a reputable Federation observer who tries to redefine fascism as